Next up is Dylan. Come on up, Dylan. You got introduced earlier. It's about as much announcement as I want to give you right now, so here you go. All right.
That's fair.
So here you go. Dylan, what is it you're talking about?
Today I'm talking about the uniqueness of Christianity among other world religions. And so just to give you some background on me, I'm adapting this talk from one that I do normally. And the group that I predominantly work with as far as other world religions and worldviews is the Latter-day Saint Church, or the Mormon Church as it may be commonly known. These are people that for nearly a decade now, the Lord has placed upon my heart as a people who desperately need the gospel. And I won't give you too many statistics because I assume that no one in here is Mormon. But some of the statistics are pretty stark. In the state of Utah, and so we're talking about an entire state. In the state of Utah, there are less than 500 evangelical Christians in the state, which makes Utah an unreached people group right here in the United States of America. Now, there are other people in Utah that would say they are Christians, maybe some that identify as Catholics, so on and so forth. But as far as active, present, there are around, I meant to say 500. I'm on medicine. 50,000 is what I meant. So let me back that up. I'm on medicine, a cold medicine right now, so my mind's not working. 50,000. 50,000 total Christians, though, in an entire state. Which, if you think about the size of Utah, that's just not very many. The entire state has 300,000 people in it. So 250,000 of them are lost. So these are people that are right here in America, and they desperately need to hear the gospel. And the reality of it is that most of them have never, ever, ever, ever even heard the gospel of the folks that live in Utah. Now, again, I'm adapting this talk, so I will not spend my time talking about only LDS. I'm going to talk about some other religions as well. But let me give you a little bit of background on me so that you kind of understand where I'm coming from. I grew up in a very small northeast Texas town called Atlanta, Texas. And if you don't know where Atlanta is, that's okay. No one does. It's home of the Atlanta Rabbits. Go Rabs. And so I grew up there, and I grew up in a population about 7,000 people. Not 67, 6 or 7,000 people. And I grew up in the church. My mom and dad had me in the church from the time I was born all the way until I graduated high school. And so I grew up literally thinking that everybody believed the same things I believed. I made an assumption. And I went to church, and I did the church things, and I was in part of the youth group, and I was even part of the youth leadership. And I was involved in church, and I loved the church, but I didn't really understand really what I believed. No, I thought I did, until I got to college. I went to college at Texas A&M University, gig 'em, whoop. And when I got there, I realized something fairly startling to me, and that was there are many people who do not believe the same things I believed. That was a shock to my system. Now, for some of you, you're like, well, yeah, obviously, you went to a big college, and you went from a very small town to a very large college population place where people have different views. But for me, it really kind of shook me. And it all came to a head. I was sitting in the student union building. I was involved in the Baptist student ministry there. And I was sitting there with some friends, and we were doing a little Bible study at one of the tables. And a guy casually walked by, and he goes, "What are y'all reading?" I said, "Well, we're reading the Bible. You want to join us?" And he goes, "No, I don't believe that expletive." And I just said, "What do you mean you don't believe the Bible?" And he goes, "There's no evidence for the Bible. It doesn't make any sense. Christianity's a hoax. It's a fairy tale. It's made up. It can't be trusted, all this kind of stuff." And then I was like, "No, dude, you're wrong." And here's what he said, and this is what shook my world. He said, "Can you give me any evidence for why you believe it? Like, why do you think it's true?" And I didn't have anything to say. All I could say, honestly, was, I grew up with it, I guess. It just makes sense to me. And so what happened was, I decided that I was not going to be put in that position again. And so I asked him for his name and number, and I said, "Hey, can I study a little bit? Can I get back to you?" And he said, "Sure, absolutely." So a couple months later, you fast forward a little bit, and I had spent a ton of time reading scripture, trying to understand it more, but I also started reading outside sources. And then I discovered this thing called apologetics, which for me was new. I didn't understand what it was. I thought it meant apologizing. And I was like, I'm not apologizing for being a Christian. But what it really meant, I found out, was to be able to give a defense and to be ready to give a defense at any moment in time. And I simply was unprepared at that moment. And so I started to study, and I began to read, and I started to listen to lectures, and I would order DVDs. This was back before streaming. I would order DVDs or VHS tapes, and I would listen to those, or cassette tapes and CDs, and listen to them in my car, and I started to consume things. And ironically, I got so involved in that my grade started to slip, but that's another story for another day. Still got my grade, and we passed. But I started to search and try to figure out, what is it you believe? What is it you claim? I knew the what. I knew what I believed, but I didn't understand why. So I began to kind of go, oh, there's actually evidence. There's actually reasons. There's actually logical things that we can talk about that make rational sense for the Christianity that I believed. And so I met with this guy again, and we had a long conversation, and he still was very adamant, but at least I was able to talk to him intelligently and rationally about what I believed. And in that moment, what happened in me was a love for apologetics. Now, Texas A&M is a very diverse place, and so I began to run into people who were not just atheists, but people who were Muslim, people who were Hindu, people who were Mormon, Jehovah's Witness. You name it, they were there. People from the Far East who had different religious beliefs, who were Taoists and deists and so on and so forth. I began to meet all kinds of people. And so I started to ask the question to myself, what makes Christianity unique among the other religions? Because all the other religions claim to have an answer, right? And that's the whole point, is they claim to have an answer. And so I started to research, started to study, and I began to consume books and books and books. And I came to the conclusion that Christianity is unique in a couple different ways, and we're going to kind of run through these. But number one, I think the reliability of the Bible, and I'm going to hit on these a lot more. I'm just giving you the summarized version. The reliability of the Bible, I think, makes it unique. Absolute truth and morality, the uniqueness of the person of Jesus and the resurrection. I think, and there are certainly more, but I think those four things offer irrefutable proof that Christianity sets itself apart from the other religions. So, when we start looking at this, the first thing we have to ask is, what is a worldview? What is it? Right? And it's an easy answer because the answer is actually in the Word. It's how you view the world. It's the lens by which you see everything. And so everyone has a worldview. Whether you acknowledge that you have a worldview or not is irrelevant. You do. Because the way you look at the world, the way you see politics, the way you see religion, the way you see everything is shaped by your worldview. And a worldview has to answer certain questions in order to be true. One of the questions it has to answer is there an ultimate reality? Is there anything beyond what I can think? Is there anything that's real? Is there something that exists? Does God exist? And if God does exist, what is God? And how can I know Him? Is He knowable? These are questions that worldview has to answer. It also has to answer questions of origin. Where did I come from? Identity. Who am I? Location. Where am I? Morals. How should I live? Past, present, destiny, so on and so forth. And I am convinced that the only worldview that can adequately answer every one of those questions is the Christian worldview. And there's several reasons for this, but again, these are the four that we're going to focus on. There's a great quote that I'm sure many of you have heard by the great C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis says this about Christianity. He says, Christianity, if true, is of infinite importance. If false, of no importance. But the only thing that it cannot be is moderately important. I think that's a very profound statement. If Christianity is true, then it has infinite implications. If it's not true, then we'll die someday and realize it and go, okay, well, I guess it wasn't true. But it can't be something that we simply say we believe and yet put no effort into talking about, discussing, proclaiming, and defending. And so as we run through these things, I want you to keep that on the back of your mind. So the first thing, is the Bible reliable? One of the questions that I often get from atheists is, why do you believe the Bible? Why do you believe that? It's just a bunch of fairy tales. It's just a bunch of stories that were put together by people. And while some of that is true, it was compiled by people in 66 different books across multiple years and in multiple locations, it's unique in a lot of different ways. When we look at the Bible, we can consider the Bible a book of antiquity, right? It's old, and there are old manuscripts. And so what's unique, though, in one sense, is that many of the old and books of antiquity we have very few copies of. Very, very few. I'll give you an example. When we look at these very important books of antiquity, there's only 7 manuscripts for Plato, 8 for Herodotus, 10 for Caesar's Gallic Wars, and 20 for Tacitus. Now, these are important. These are important historical documents, things that we know were written by these people, things that we know exist, things that we know were written at certain time periods. And they're wildly huge in shaping much of the philosophy and the religion that many people adhere to today. And yet, there are only a few copies total. And yet, before 1890, so before the year 1890, over 731 Old Testament manuscripts had been verified. 731 before 1890. And it gets even crazier. Since that time, some 10,000 Old Testament manuscripts were found in Cairo. Just in this amount of time. Now, it gets even weirder, it gets even crazier. Then in 1947, we discovered something in Qumran called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are wildly important. The Dead Sea Scrolls verify a lot of what we already knew. And since then, they have produced over, just in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran caves have produced over 600 different Old Testament manuscripts, including a complete copy of the book of Isaiah. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at these copies, these manuscripts, they read the same that they read in our Bibles today. Now, there have been some modifications to some grammar. There's been some modifications to a few things in punctuation. And in a few words, I think about 15 to 18 different words have been substituted. But none of the context has changed. None of the meaning has changed in all these different manuscripts. And these predate many manuscripts that we even know about. Okay, so we know that just in the Old Testament, that there are so many different manuscripts that it is unbelievable when we look at other books of antiquity. When you start to compare, you go, okay, well, these books of antiquity we have, but there's only a few copies, whereas the Bible, just the Old Testament, we have literally thousands and thousands of manuscripts. Now, what about the New Testament? The New Testament is important too. We can't just have the Old Testament, we've got to have the New Testament. So is it verifiable? Is it knowable? Are there manuscripts for it? The New Testament manuscripts, we have an overwhelming nearly 5,700 Greek manuscripts in the original Greek. I want you to think about that for a moment. So we've got thousands of the Old Testament manuscripts, and we've got thousands of the Greek New Testament manuscripts. And none of them have been altered since they were written. Right now, we don't have any of the originals. We don't have the original letters written by Paul. But we have our codexes. And a codex was simply a copy. They didn't have printing presses, right? So they would literally take these books, they would take these letters, and they would copy them word for word. And they were passed down and passed down and passed down and sent to other people and sent to other places so that they might too hear about these things. And so the closest example that we have of another book of antiquity that has many copies is Homer's Iliad. Now, Homer's Iliad has the second most copies of a book of antiquity other than the New Testament at 643. So there are 643 manuscripts of Homer's Iliad in existence, whereas just in the Greek New Testament we have over 5,700. Gary Habermas, who is a brilliant scholar, says this, and it's a fairly long quote, so stay with me for a moment, but he said, "It is known that Quirinus was made governor of Syria by Augustus in AD 6. Archaeologist William Ramsay discovered several inscriptions that indicated that Quirinus was governor of Syria on 2 different occasions, the first time several years prior to this date. What this goes to do is establish facts from archaeology that also assist in establishing things. 1, that a taxation census was a fairly common procedure in the Roman Empire, and it did occur in Judea. 2, persons are required to return to their home city in order to fulfill the requirements and processes. And 3, these procedures were apparently employed during the reign of Augustus, placing it well within the general time frame of Jesus' birth." So what he's saying is, based on not only the manuscripts that we have, but based on the historical knowledge that we have, they line up. History, archaeology, and these manuscripts which we have for the Bible all go together. They don't have anything that would discount one another or that would jeopardize the other. They fit nicely together. That cannot be coincidence. It would be impossible. For all of these things to fit neatly together, it would have to be something that is true and verifiable. And it's not just the Greek New Testament and it's not just the Hebrew Old Testament that show us that the Bible can be reliable. There are extra biblical sources that also give us credence to these things. Josephus Flavius is one. He is a Jewish scholar, historian, who lived around the time of Jesus. Now, he was Jewish, he was not a Christian, but he wrote history. And he kept documented books that he wrote that proclaimed what he was seeing. And if you've never read Josephus' book on history, I would encourage you to do that. We don't have time to really go into all the detail of it, but he corroborates many of the things that are going on in the New Testament, particularly in the life of Jesus and those around him. And so it's not just that Christians have a bias toward Paul and Mark and Matthew and all the authors of the New Testament and then have a bias toward the Old Testament as well. It's that there are credible, certifiable historians, philosophers, and the like who also claim these things happened. And Mark touched on this a little bit in his talk as well. So that's the first thing that we know, is that the Bible is reliable. The other thing that I think we have to understand, and Mark touched on this as well, is absolute truth and morality. Absolute truth and morality. Now, I don't think there's a religion out there, really, other than some very pagan ones, that would say that morals don't exist. Everybody intrinsically knows that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. We just do. We're wired that way. And of course, for Christians, we would say the reason we're wired that way is because there is a God who is the moral lawgiver, who writes that moral law upon our hearts. And so we know, even as a child, we know that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. We know that certain things are evil and certain things are good. We have an understanding, a very basic understanding of that, even as children. And I know this because I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I've seen them be evil. And I've seen them do things that they know they shouldn't do, and they do them anyway, right? So they know what's right, they know what's wrong. So how do we explain this outside of the Christian worldview? I don't think we can, and I'll talk more on that in just a moment. But here's what the Christian worldview says. It says that God's creation was perfect and it was good. Genesis 1. Right? So God creates, God ordains, God does what he does, and it is good. And so after everything that God created, he said what? It was very good. It's good. So God is creating, God is sovereign, God is good. Fast forward, Genesis chapter 3, and everything takes a turn. In Genesis 3, something happened. We messed up. We decided to do our own thing. We believed the lie that to be more like God, we should be less like God and disobey him. And that's exactly what happened. So Genesis 3 happens. Adam and Eve disobey. They disbelieve. And now sin enters the world. Well, that's problematic for us because now we find that we are broken. And not only that we're broken, but we are in active rebellion against a holy God. I love the way R.C. Sproul puts it. He calls it cosmic treason. We are in cosmic treason against a holy God. So every human is now under the law of rebellion. We mess up. We break things. We ushered in death and sin and so on and so forth. And so we know that the answer for why we are the way we are is because we disobeyed a holy God. So how do other worldviews, how do other world religions account for this? Well, there's a couple of things. One is to say there is no moral law. There is no objective morality. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Anybody with just a few moments to talk about this would understand why that doesn't work. If there's no objective morality, then nothing is essentially right or wrong. And if nothing is right or wrong, then nothing matters. Here's what I mean by that. If nothing is objectively right or wrong, then the Holocaust was not objectively right or wrong. then rape is not objectively right or wrong. Murder is not objectively right or wrong, but it is simply based upon the whims of the one committing the act. It's subjective. And if everything is subjective, and if there is no absolute moral law by which we abide by, then there's no justice. And if there's no justice, then there is nothing that we can have a hope for. So that could be one claim from atheists, is that, man, there is no moral law. There is no objective standard. There is no thing that we have inside of us that tells us what is right and wrong. We just figure it out. The other option that I've heard multiple times from a friend recently, in fact, is that we evolved a sense of right and wrong, or we evolved a sense of empathy. I find that to be problematic as well. In the idea of Darwinism, what we find is the principle of, and I'm sure you're all familiar with, the survival of the fittest. Well, if Darwinism claims that survival of the fittest is the mechanism by which we continue to procreate and grow and all these kinds of things, and the lesser or the weaker get kind of killed off, and the greater improve and get bigger, get better, then why would I care about what happens to my neighbor? If it benefits me for you to die, I'm okay with it, according to social Darwinism and according to biological Darwinism. If social justice doesn't exist, if some sort of intrinsic understanding of morality doesn't exist, how could I evolve some sense of empathy when it benefits me for you to be in a worse position? Because ultimately, if you die, I get your crops, I get your food, I get whatever. I gain from it. So that goes against the biological idea of Darwinian evolution. So where then did we get this idea of right and wrong? By the way, I've yet to find a single atheist in my own personal encounters. I'm sure there are some that exist, but I've yet to find one that agrees that the Holocaust could not be considered evil. Right? Because nobody wants to say anything like that because that sounds crazy. But the reality of it is, if objective moral laws do not exist, then the Holocaust was just fine. It doesn't matter. Life doesn't matter. Everything is subjective, and you can do whatever you want without any consequence. Morality, though, gives us the very nature of who we are, and it gives us the character and the nature of God within us. This is why I believe in objective morality. Objective morality shows us what is good and what is evil. And God claims that He is good. So if God is good, then anything good that happens within us is from Him. But we also know that there are parts of us that are clearly wrong, clearly messed up. And we see this in the Bible, going back to the reliability of Scripture. We see this in the Bible in Romans chapter 7. When Paul says, man, the things that I do are the things I don't want to do, and the things that I'm doing are the things that I shouldn't be doing. And like, oh, wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of death? And what he is telling us is, I am struggling. There is a war within me. The things that I know I need to be doing and should be doing, I'm not doing those because I'm having a war within me from my flesh and my spirit. And the only worldview that I believe accounts for any sort of true objective morality is the Christian worldview. In fact, I would argue that anybody, whether they're Christian or not, who claims that there are moral laws that exist, that there are certain things that are good or evil, they're borrowing from the Judeo-Christian worldview. They have to borrow that because no other worldview accounts for that. The Islamic worldview borrows from the Judeo-Christian worldview. The Mormon worldview borrows from the Judeo-Christian worldview. The atheist worldview borrows from the Christian worldview. Why? Because it's the only worldview that exists that accurately answers, is there something intrinsically right, and is there something intrinsically wrong? And if so, where does it come from? So every other religion, every other worldview that claims that there are certain things that are good and evil, right and wrong, must borrow from the Christian worldview. Otherwise, there is no standard for right and wrong. The only standard that we have is that God is good. And anything that is not God is not good by nature. So in order for us as Christians to claim that there is anything good within us, it's not anything that has to do with us. It is all because of what God is doing and has done with us and for us. So when we look at the worldviews, the only one that makes any sense in regards to objective morality, of course, is Christianity. The third thing I think is this, the uniqueness of the person of Jesus. When we look at Jesus, he's unique in a bunch of different ways, right? One of the most unique ways is that no other world religion does their primary figure ever claim to be God other than Jesus. They claim to be around gods, to know gods, to talk with gods. But Jesus is the only figure in any major world religion who ever makes the claim, I am God. Now, will you find the words, I am God, written in the Bible? No. But over and over again, what we see is Jesus calling himself God in different ways. And so the idea that Jesus was not God and was not man, he was not fully both, is debunked. Jesus himself claimed multiple times throughout the New Testament that he and God were one. He and the Father were one. And so when we look at Christianity, when we look at the worldview that we adhere to, it's unique simply in that fact that Jesus is the only central figure in any major world religion who ever claimed to be God. Now, it gets even better. Not only did he claim to be God, but when we look at the prophecies surrounding Jesus, it's pretty interesting stuff. Out of all the books that have been written, and there's a lot, from atheists, from Jewish people, from Mormons, from anybody else who want to debunk the Christian worldview, there has not been a single source, a single book, or a single piece of evidence that has ever shown us that the prophecies were untrue, that they were unfulfilled. Why? Because we have more evidence to support that the prophecies of Jesus were fulfilled. And it's not just Jesus, but there's a bunch of different ones. So let me just give you a few that you can kind of get a hold of. So what we see, the first prophecy that I think is really important is Isaiah chapter 7 tells us that Jesus is going to be born of a virgin. Keep in mind, this is hundreds of years before Jesus is actually born. So born of a virgin. Matthew 1, Jesus is born of a virgin. Prophecy fulfilled. Number 2. That he would come from the seed of Abraham. Genesis 22 tells us this, and I'm just going to read this to you. And through your offspring, all the nations on the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Matthew 1:1. Record the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So there's 2 right there fulfilled. He'd come from the house of David. He'd be born in Bethlehem. He would be a prophet. He'd be a priest. He would be a king. He would be a judge. His side would be pierced. He would be crucified. One of the prophecies that I think is the most unique, however, is that in Isaiah 53, we even find that it tells us that Jesus would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And of course, we know Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Why should we believe these prophecies existed? Why is it not just a bunch of made-up stuff? How do we know that they're reliable? Well, again, let's go back to the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, it gives us the test of a prophet. Now, this is important because the test of a prophet determines a lot of things. The test of a prophet is simply this. If any prophecy at any point in time that a prophet makes does not come true, he is a false prophet. And further, what Deuteronomy 18 says is that not only if he is proven a false prophet, you should not fear him and he should be put to death. So why would the Old Testament, knowing that the test of a prophet is death and being claimed to be a false prophet, why would they purposefully make these prophecies without having any idea if they were really going to come true? They wouldn't. God inspired them. God showed them. God used Isaiah and other prophets to say this is what is going to happen, and is exactly what happened. Now, you compare that with other world religions, and they don't have as good of an average. In the Mormon worldview, for example, if you look just at the prophecies that Joseph Smith, the founder, made, 0 have come true. One of the most telling, which I think is really interesting, is that he claimed that before the end of his generation, in other words, before the last person in his generation would die, that a temple would be built in Independence, Missouri. It's not there. Now, they have the land, and there's an empty lot, but there's no temple there. So how do they account for that? How do they account for the idea that a prophecy was made that before the end of Joseph Smith's generation, who was killed in 1844, how do they account for that when there's no temple there today? Well, there's a lot of different ways they try to get around it, but the simple answer is he's a failed prophet. The Quran. The Quran is full of prophecies. Unfortunately, the Quran is full of prophecies that also have not come true. And when you start to cross-examine the prophecies of these major world religions, Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses. By the way, Jehovah's Witnesses was founded by a man who was built on prophecy, who said that the world was going to end, Jesus was going to come back, and he failed 3 different times and then was like, oh, he actually did come back, but he's just invisible. Which is what their religion is founded upon. It's predicated on that. They say that Jesus is here because it's at the kingdom age. That's what they say, the kingdom hall, Jehovah's Witnesses. We're in the kingdom age. Why? Because it's better to look like a crazy person or just look like a fool who's a false prophet. So when we look at major world religions and we look at their prophecies that are given, and every world religion that has some sort of a monotheistic type God has a prophecy or several prophecies that were made within it, and then you compare those prophecies with the truth of the prophecies given in Scripture, they don't really compare. The Bible's prophecies are true. We've seen them proven true time and time again. And it wasn't just the prophecies about Jesus, but it was many other things. We see this over and over again throughout Scripture. It's a running theme. So just to give you an idea of how crazy it is for these prophecies to come true, I'm going to give you some numbers. And these numbers hurt my head, so good luck with y'all too, because this is going to hurt your brains for a minute, but I think you need to hear this. A guy named Peter Stoner, back in 1963, started to do some calculations. And these are some of the calculations that he came up with. He said that just the probability that just eight of the prophecies about Jesus would come true. If just 8 of them had come true, the probability was 1 chance in 10 to the 17th power. Now, to give you a number or an idea about how large that number is, this is what he said. He said that take that number, 10 by 17, number of silver dollars, and lay them on the face of Texas, they would cover the entire state 2 feet deep. Now, it gets a little crazier. He said, now mark one of these silver dollars and stir all them up thoroughly all over the state and blindfold a man and tell him that he can travel as far as he wishes, but he must pick up one silver dollar and it has to be the right one that was marked. What chance would he have of getting the right one? The exact same chance that the prophets had of getting all 8 prophecies correct. So it could not have been just conjecture. It could not have been just lucky guesses. And it could not have been coincidences. If that was the case, then probably none of these prophecies would have come true. They would have just been guesses. But we know that these prophecies were not just guesses because they actually did come true. Now, he considers that not only 8, but 48 prophecies, and he said that we would find a chance that one man fulfilled all 48 prophecies to be 1 in 10 to the 157th power. It's staggering. It's a staggering number to think that one man would be able to fulfill 48 different prophecies. And yet, Jesus fulfills all 48. Not 8, 48. That is unique. That is unique among all the world religions. It is unique among all the worldviews. It is unique among anything outside of Christianity. We don't see this. Quickly, I have to run through this, but quickly also, what we also see about Jesus that makes him unique is that Jesus performed miracles. And these were not just things that the disciples wrote and said, hey, these are kind of cool, let's make some stuff up. These were witnessed and verified by multiple people outside of just his disciples. To give you a few examples of the miracles that he did, that many people saw. Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding. That's pretty visible. He cast out demons. He healed lepers. He healed a paralytic. He restored sight to the blind. He fed a multitude. That one's pretty interesting. We know that at least 5,000 men were there, and probably women too, so there was a lot of folks there, and they all saw him take a couple of loaves of bread and some fish and break it up, and everybody ate, and there was baskets left over. There's witnesses to this. There's reliability to this. We look at eyewitness accounts and we go, oh, that's important. That's a lot of people to seeing the same thing. Jesus also calmed a storm. He walked on water. And perhaps most importantly, he rose from the dead. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because Mark has already given us a great insight on this. But the understanding of the resurrection is the most unique thing in Christianity. In fact, Paul argued in 1 Corinthians 15 that if the resurrection didn't occur, then we, above all human beings, are to be pitied above all. If the resurrection didn't happen, then none of this matters. If the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is false. If the resurrection didn't happen, then we don't have any reason to be here. If the resurrection happened, then the worldview that we hold to is simply empty. But on the other hand, if the resurrection did occur, if the resurrection did happen, the implications are infinite. And so I believe that the resurrection is the most powerful piece of evidence that we have for the truth claims that we make about Christianity. If the resurrection did not occur, then nothing we say matters. But if the resurrection did occur, then it gives a reliability and credence to every other part of what we believe as Christians. Now, there is one theory that I think is the most interesting theory, and I just want to talk about this for a moment on the resurrection. Again, Mark has already hit on a lot of these, and so I think I don't want to reiterate a lot, but one of the theories that he touched on about the resurrection, and it's not happening, is this theory called the swoon theory. And this was kind of made famous in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. But the swoon theory is really intriguing. And here's essentially what the swoon theory is. The swoon theory is that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He was very badly injured and very badly beaten. But when they put him in the tomb, he wasn't actually dead. And so it was 3 days later when he finally regained his strength that he actually got up and walked out. But there's a lot of holes in this theory, as you can already tell. Let me give you just a few of the holes in this theory. Number one, there's no way Jesus could have survived the crucifixion. It's impossible. Even people who are medical doctors today, who are not believers, would say that if you looked at what happened at the crucifixion, and you did an autopsy or a medical examination, it would have been impossible for anyone to have survived what took place. Right? So the beating he took was so severe, and then basically asphyxiation, dry drowning on the cross would have been horrific. But not only that, as you will note, one of the prophecies about Jesus was that he would not have his legs broken. So, of course, he didn't have his legs broken. They thrust a spear into his side, and blood and water flowed out, indicating that Jesus was certainly dead. Secondly, the Roman soldier and the two other folks that were there did have their legs broken. So why not Jesus? Again, it fulfills a prophecy. The third part is John, who was an eyewitness, saw the spear go in. He saw the blood and water flow out, and any medical examiner today would tell you that that would indicate he was dead. The fourth one, and this was interesting, the body, after it was taken from the cross, would have been cleaned and then totally encased in linen. And it wasn't just a layer of linen, because linen is pretty light fabric, but it would have been multiple layers. And it would have been very tight. It would have been very heavy. And so if he hadn't been killed on the cross, then he certainly would have suffocated under the weight of all the linen that he was wrapped in. 6, how were the Roman guards at the tomb overpowered by a corpse or someone who was almost a corpse? If Jesus was so badly beaten that he was unrecognizable, he had had so much blood loss, he'd been stabbed in his side with blood and water pouring out, how was it that this one man who was at death's door was able to overpower an entire Roman legion? I'd love to know that. Unfortunately, we don't have to know that because it's not true. The fifth thing, how was a half-dead man able to move the great stone that sealed the tomb? I'd love to know that too. I'd love to know how someone who is weak beyond what we can imagine, who is dehydrated, who has lost almost all their blood, who has been stabbed, beaten, scourged, nailed to a cross. I'd love to know how that person is able to break the seal of a stone, number one, and number two, remove it. And so when we look at this story, the idea that Jesus was simply almost dead doesn't add up. And so we're left with a very peculiar moment that we have to come to. Either the resurrection occurred or it didn't. And the evidence for the resurrection, again, as Mark greatly pointed out, the evidence for the resurrection is insurmountable. I think the resurrection, honestly, is the greatest piece of evidence that we have for the truth claims of Christianity. And so when we look at different religions, what do they claim about the resurrection? Islam claims that Jesus was crucified, but it wasn't actually Jesus, that he just changed his appearance. So somebody that looked like Jesus was crucified, so it wasn't actually him. Again, there's no credible evidence to sustain that. There's nothing that we have that would go, oh, that makes sense. It doesn't make any sense. The Mormon religion, what do they say about the resurrection? Well, number one, the resurrection wasn't really that necessary because they don't believe that the cross was necessary because Jesus shed his blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. So again, the resurrection is not that important. So when you look at the other world religions that exist, you look at all of them and you line them up, the resurrection doesn't matter to them at all, which negates who Jesus is, which negates his uniqueness. But in Christianity, we make the claim that if the resurrection didn't occur, then none of the other stuff is reliable, none of the other stuff is worth believing. And so if the resurrection is true, then I make the argument today, we can solidly and absolutely claim that the worldview that is provided for the Christian worldview, is the only one that answers questions of morality. It's the only one that answers questions of eternity. And it's the only one that answers questions of truth. How can I know something is true? How can I know something is right? How can I know where I end up? No other religion in the world can tell us that other than Christianity with any assurance. And here's why, and I'll close with this. Every religion in the world outside of the biblical view of Christianity claims that you have to work in order to gain some sort of salvation or some sort of afterlife approval. It's works-based. In other words, you do what you have to do and hopefully you can get in. You do what you have to do and hopefully it was good enough. And so there is no assurance of salvation in these religions. This is true not only in Islam, but this is true especially in the vein of Mormonism. And again, I'm talking a lot about this particular worldview because it's the one that I'm most familiar with outside of Christianity. But the idea in Mormonism is this. They believe in grace after all you can do. In other words, I'm going to do my very best and I'm going to be really good and I'm going to follow these rules and I'm going to get sealed in a temple and I'm going to do all these things. And hopefully at the end of my life, I was good enough that Jesus' blood could cover the rest of my stuff. That is not assurance. Islam is similar. Islam is also a religion, a worldview that claims you have to do these things and follow 5 pillars and make your pilgrimage and do all these things. And hopefully you die on a day when Allah is in a particularly good mood. Otherwise, sorry. However, with Christianity, if it is true, then what it tells us is that not only can we not earn our way into heaven, not only can we not buy our way into heaven, but that we would never be capable of doing such a thing anyway. And that only one person is sufficient. Only one person can do these things, and we find that person in Jesus Christ. John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Every world religion outside of the Christian worldview fails to offer any assurance that there is something more than this life. But Christianity says not only is there something more, there's something greater, but it's only found in the person of Jesus Christ, and it's only found for those who identify and believe in him and follow the biblical Christian worldview. So when we look at world religions, I believe that Christianity is wholly unique amongst the other ones. And if we had more time, we could certainly sit and talk about these other religions and different worldviews and how they differ in other ways. But I think in these 4 ways, the reliability of the Bible, the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, truth and morality, and the resurrection, it paints a picture that it is unique among every other worldview that exists. And it is the only one that we can truly have any trust and reliability in. So thank you all very much. That's kind of the end of my talk. I'll let Mark.